Detroit.
Yeah, I discovered what I'd been working on this, figuring out how to work it. So,
We're live now.
all right.
Well, hello, everybody, and I'm here with my cup of coffee with a really good friend of mine. I tend to try and surround myself with really smart people so that I can look even smarter than I might be. And so one of the luminaries that I communicate with on occasion is Christopher Earl Strunk, who's quite a remarkable patriot, as I guess I would call him. And he has done more work than most people you've ever met trying to figure out exactly what's going on and the historical basis of why things happen and how we got to where we are today. And so here we are with Christopher Earl Strunk, my friend. Hi, how you doing there?
I'm doing just fine, I guess, considering the conditions that we're having to live under.
Yeah, can you bump your volume up a little bit?
Do
you have that capability?
Let's see, bump my volume. Can I do it from this end? Testing 1, 2, 3.
I think
testing.
so.
Testing. Is that better?
No? I don't know. We'll just continue and see what happens.
Okay.
So anyways,
okay,
so don't get lost in the weeds here. We can
right.
We can just keep moving. And so, well, with my frequent conversations with all my associates over at American Intelligence Media, Douglas and Tyler Gabriel and Michael McKibben over at Americans for Innovation and a whole other cast of characters that have contributed to the knowledge basis that is American Intelligence Media, AIM for Truth, and various other platforms, and the Americans for Innovation that has a 20-year or so timeline. And part of the thematic search plot that we've been looking at is something that we call Crowngate. And if you go to my Twitter thread and you go to what it says right here, at John Barnwell 888, parked at the top of my Twitter account, is a page-by-page storyline of what we call Crowngate, and that has to do with this the activities of the City of London, the City of Rome, the City of Washington, the City of New York, and all the various people working within what we'll call the cabal, and how much of it is tied together. It's something with, a couple hundred entries on it, but you might have to search for the later parts because the chain would get broken. But when that first came out, I got more than 2 million impressions over a period of just a few weeks, and then they noticed I was there, and then they pushed it down. But it still keeps going, but there's aspects of this, some of the finer details of this that Christopher Strunk here has expert knowledge, and we started talking just the other day about the role that Amsterdam plays, and that's an interesting plot line because it gives you kind of the schematic basis of corporatism, because it really, corporatism and the form in which it ended up is really a brainchild of the Dutch East India Company. And Then you have the interplay between them and the British East India Company and all the various corporate entities that have since sprouted out. But even still to this day, one of the top registrars for corporate papers is CT Corporation, which is a Dutch company. So they're still in the mix. And don't forget, New York used to be New Amsterdam. Chris, how are you?
I'm just fine. I'm mixing, getting familiar with this broadcasting system, and I've got I put up 3 maps, which maybe will connect you out there in the Great Lakes with New York. You know, New York has a patent extended from Connecticut all the way to Lansing, and that was one of the battles which the founders were arguing over. You know, Governor Clinton at the time did not want to get involved with Virginia, and that they were the ones that forced the natural born citizen issue and the issues having to do with New York's geographic interests, which pretty much controlled the Great Lakes. You've got Lake Ontario that dumps into Lake Erie through the Niagara Falls. You've got Lake Huron or Michigan Huron and Lake Superior, which is the most interesting one for travel along the St. Lawrence Seaway, which goes out, empties into the Atlantic Ocean. Well, seeing all that, the Dutch, who in 1609, Henry Hudson went up the Hudson River with his half moon, his little boat, and he goes up that. I'm living on the Hudson River. I can see it. It's about 150 yards from where I'm at, and that I'm at the headwaters, and that it's sort of like living up. I used to live in New York City. I was born in New York City, in Manhattan, and it's an experience being up here because I'm in a county which is it's for tourism, and I'm in the midst of what's called the Adirondack Preservation Area, and it's like being in the midst of Sherwood Forest. Look but don't touch. You know, they want to get rid of the human beings, and well, there's a trade-off between the tax rolls and the need for the Democrats to run the government and be able to extract large annual tax payments. But this is up near Lake George, which is you've got a series of very interesting lake systems, Lake Champlain, etc. But anyway, Henry Hudson, seeing what he had stumbled across, he said, "Boy, this is something that we're going to bring home." And Peter Stuyvesant essentially was the one who the Dutch had clean up the British or the English pirates in the Caribbean. And in one of the battles, he lost his leg, had it shot off, and that he recouped and was put in charge of Manhattan, and that's when the British came in. And he just didn't. He had 50 men, and that was down at the fort down at the tip of Manhattan, and he just couldn't deal with the size of the British or the English fleet, and he made a deal. The Dutch went up the Hudson River, where they had already they had their trapping and fur operations and their extractive industries. We had garnet and precious metals. We had huge iron deposits up here, and that still are here. And it arguably competes with the Mesabi range, and that of Minnesota. and that the resources were what uh, Governor George Clinton was concerned about. He did not want the British to get control of New York, and we were the ones that came up with natural-born citizen issues, and still to this day we have law which says that if you have a foreign citizen in your family, you cannot allow them to inherit a piece of the New York State real estate having to do with coal in particular. We've got coal, and that. So I'm all over the map here, but basically the intrigues that were afoot between the Dutch and the British are still they're still here, and that your streets and avenues are named after Dutchmen upstate, and that the Schuyler County, you have Hamilton who marries a Schuyler of Schuyler County, and that of course you've got a large German population, and it was sort of indistinguishable at that point between the Dutch and the Germans until we have the line of DNA run out where they had to bring in a German under William and Mary to provide some DNA into the system after Charles II lost his head, and Charles I, and this is where Douglas comes in. He can do all the lines of the peerage, all that sort of thing. But it was the Germans came in, and in that you have the Hessians who were hired mercenaries during the Revolutionary War. New York is where all the battles initially took place, in Saratoga and the Battle of and that of course the British and the Dutch were as the British and Dutch East India Company were a force to contend with, and that they did not want to deal with the French, but Rochambeau, who came in and helped Washington and etc. But New York is the intrigues are buried, and what I was interested in doing in any discussions is to bring in the maps and the relationship of maps and geography to discussions. That makes it more interesting, sort of gives a sense of the geography and the greed which drives the British East India Company and their present intrigues, which are using their influence for the Chinese.
Yeah, well, in current events, a lot has come forth as of late. There's a book that came out from Amsterdam University Press, and it's by Robert Parthesius, and Dutch Ships in Tropical Waters, the Development of the Dutch East India Company, that's known as VOC, Shipping Network in Asia, 1595 to 1660. And in there, it's a scholarly work, so don't expect it to be an exciting read. It's just a testimony regarding the degree and extent to which the Dutch were so successful in developing, in many ways, monopolistic developments. They took it as far as they could. They were really kind of the people that invented what we now call vertical integration. And that's where you control every step, all the way from growing it, manufacturing it, shipping it, and selling it, so that you're fully involved in every aspect of it. And really, the way they started out is that there were all these operations going on in the late 1500s and into the early 1600s. Of the way they would do it is somebody would have a ship and they would get people to finance the operation to go trade, going around the Cape of Good Horn and go and get spices. And but that was a very perilous investment. Although if they succeeded, you could end up with multiplication of your investment, like 4 or 5 times what you put into it. But ships would be lost, and so what the Dutch started to do, they drew everything together into the Dutch East India Company, and that's, of course, how we refer to it in English, but the VOC is the coding for it. And I don't want to destroy the Dutch pronunciation of the name, but you can get a lot of information if you just look up the Dutch East India Company on Wikipedia or somewhere. There's actually a lot of information about it. It's just that nobody tends to talk about it in regards to current events. But if you look at that, and I think back to some research I was doing back in the late 70s, early 80s, and I came across data that showed that the number 2 country for people owning real estate in the United States was Amsterdam, or the Netherlands. You know that, and that, I mean, that really surprised me that they had the largest land holdings, foreign land holdings in the United States at that time. I don't know what it's at, where it's at right now, but it just shows you that they never went away. And like Chris was discussing, where he talked about Alexander Hamilton marrying a member of the Stuyvesant family. And so that played very strongly into the way in which his version of government and what it should entail, that played very strongly into that vision. And you have to keep in mind that the American flag is essentially a replica of the flag of the British East India Company with the stripes. And sometimes there's 13 stripes, sometimes 9 stripes on the British East India Company flag. And then up in the corner, instead of having the stars that we have representing the states, they would have the Union Jack. But before that, it was just a gold cross. And then when King James came along, he was Scottish. He put in the St. Andrew's cross overlaying the upright cross. And so that you have your traditional Union Jack that everybody's familiar with. Well, we substituted the stars for the States of the Union, originally 13 stars. And so everybody knows that, but most people, I'm sure, don't know that our flag was based on the British East India Company flag. And so Rudolf Steiner had once commented that one of the challenges of America is that it was really founded as a commercial venture. And that flag is telling. They wanted to be able to have the kind of liberty that the British East India Company had in India. They ruled India, representing the crown, and that's the way it was conceived. They were really a kind of a crown corporation, which had different controls on it than the Dutch version of a corporate entity, and the modern corporate entity is evolved out of the Dutch model. And so these things have a far more significance than anyone would tend to surmise.
To this day, one of the deals with the Dutch was that the British they gave away something they had no control over to begin with, and that was Indonesia. And that they traded Indonesia. There in 1302, there was a Unum Sanctum grab by the Vatican of the entire globe, and their claim to be domination, to be the Pope essentially controlled the globe, everything. So that to the extent that the 1213 concession by King John had already given the Pope the control of any possession that the English may have in the future. You know, what King John had done is he had borrowed money in order to get King Richard out of captivity. He was on his way back from the Crusades, and he was captive, and he had blown all the money. King John had blown all the money, or he was actually Prince John at that point. And I think he wanted to leave Richard in the castle, but he couldn't survive with the barons of Scotland, etc., if he were to do that. But so he borrowed money from the Pope, and in order to pay that, he gave a concession in October. Actually, it was October. Maybe it was June. Well, time flies. October of 1213. Leo talks about this, but that's what gave the Pope the ability to claim a monetary annual monetary payment from the English to this day on all of their possessions, and so that's what brings the Vatican into the concession. But that was Henry VIII came along in the 1500s, and he said, or 1400s, and he said, enough with that stuff. And the Henry VIII in particular had seized all of the nunneries and all of the monasteries and turned them into stables, and essentially seized all of the Vatican's property, which is an intrigue of interest. And his inquisitor, and this is Catholic at the time. Henry VIII wanted to have a divorce. He was the six wives. You know, he wanted another divorce, and the Vatican had said no, so he just seized all of the Vatican's property. And Thomas More, who was a fly in the ointment as the inquisitor, was finally just caused too much problem, and he had his head cut off on the I think it was 1535, and the Vatican had decided that they weren't going to put up with this, and they had given the sanction of Loyola to be created, and he was the return of the Knights Templar in a military form, where they were put in place to assume control of the Inquisition after the death of Thomas More. More was doing torture and all sorts, extracting information and flaying people in his basement. When he died, they went in and they found the remnants of bodies and all sorts. He was a very evil person. But so he had his head cut off, and then Loyola came in to assume control of the Inquisition, and they created called the Council of Trent, which went from 1435 to 1545 to 1547, and it created a doctrine that said all Protestants must be extirpated, and the Pope and the Jesuit army would essentially dedicate itself to recover everything that Henry VIII had stolen and everything else. So that was sort of the intrigue after the death of Thomas More. I went up against the Thomas More Society last year when maybe I shouldn't get into that because it's the 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 Jesuits control New York, specifically the Cuomo family. Although Mario was out of St. John's, um, Chris and Andrew were both out of Fordham, and Fordham being the sort of the toehold on New York, and next to Syracuse University, which where the present governor Hochul went, and actually Roy Cohn went there too. He was the only way a Jew could become an attorney was to get a Jesuit sanction allowing them to practice law. So that Roy Cohn went to Syracuse, and he was, of course, controller for Trump, and he was the one that could deal with the mafia, the Gambinos, and that crowd of the crowd in Manhattan, which were controlling the mafia families. But that the point being is that the intrigue that was set up by the Council of Trent remains in place. People don't know anything about it, but that's pretty much what when you see a Jesuit, that's what they're practicing. It's the extirpation, control, or elimination of the influence of the Protestants in, and of course, the United States it slipped out of their control. The control of Nova Scotia spread into Maryland, and that Maryland, as a British colony, there was a sort of a standoff between the Protestants in Virginia, where it was outlawed. You could not have a Catholic mass in Virginia, and it was sort of a trade-off where Maryland could have a Catholic mass. And of course, later on down the line, John Carroll, who was the bishop, the Jesuit bishop of Americas, and the Carroll family being the front end of all importation of slaves out of Maryland. That was the Carroll family. They played into all this intrigue, and I think Franklin, who I think he was a wannabe Jesuit, but that they wearing black, they both wore black, and that Franklin arranged for the Catholics to be able to do their first mass. Right? It was illegal. You'd get arrested for doing a Catholic mass, so that Franklin arranged so the Catholics could do a mass in Philadelphia, which didn't go over very well. Yes.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of the story, because you have Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and he's like a distant relation on my mother's side, but on the old Catholic, Irish Catholic lines. But the Carrolls, they're Carrolls of Ely, or Ely O'Carroll, and the Charles Carroll and then John Carroll of Carrollton, who was the Archbishop of the United States. There was interesting
provision. Was the colonies at that point?
Yeah, colonies at the time, but they were responsible for large land donations to establish the capital of Washington. And Charles Carroll's he was the longest living of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was an interesting guy. He sent his son to London to study law, and in his letters he says, I'm sending you there to study law, not because I want you to become a lawyer, but to protect you from the lawyers. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. I haven't read the letter in a few years, but yeah, he was a real firebrand. But he got some concessions regarding the framing of the Constitution that are pretty interesting. That Chris has mentioned before to me.
But the drafting of the Declaration of Independence went through several drafts. The first draft, 25% of the second, or the final, took 25% of the language which had attacked King George in the slave trade. And it was mandated by Charles and John Carroll to take that out, or else they weren't going to help the enterprise to do the revolution. And that was the threat. And Franklin was unhappy, and certainly Thomas Paine was severely unhappy. He had been a English tax collector, and he was fed up, and he met Franklin, and Franklin sent him over to the print business in Philadelphia. You know, Franklin himself, just let me step back here, he came in, he was a Mather, came out of the Cotton Mather crowd, increase in Cotton Mather out of Massachusetts, and he ran away because he didn't want to get vaccinated. He didn't want to get inoculated. So Increase Mather was giving everybody the smallpox. He talks about this in his autobiography, Franklin does, where he knew nothing of. He was a young man, and he knew nothing of printing, but he ran away and became an apprentice to a printer. You know, you had the Gutenberg press, you know, and that sort of thing, which was really what revolutionized everything, was the ability to do mass printing. But anyway, Franklin ran away to Philadelphia, and he became a printer, and he was an hobnobber, and his son became the governor of New Jersey. So he had really, because of his family's relationship to the throne, he wanted to, you know, make nice, and that he didn't want his son, who became a governor in one generation. You know, he went from a pauper to a governor in one generation, and he wanted to make nice. He wanted to make the nastiness of the letters of 1775, etc. He wanted, working with Edmund Burke, to become members of Parliament and everything. You know, so there was a big anti-revolution crowd. But that, you know, I mean, that's delusional. But and certainly with the Dutch, they had their fill, and but they were upstate. They were doing what they were doing upstate. Leave us alone, you know. And they influenced George Clinton. But that I put up a map of New York's control all the way out to the Lake Superior, and that we just did not want to get involved in a revolution, and that New York didn't, because we didn't need anybody. We didn't need Virginia. We understood Maryland, and it was not easy to do the Declaration of Independence, and certainly the Constitution was a real mess. You know, to get that thing in place. John Jay and that crowd. You know, John Jay was a slaveholder, right? He had in the Mid-Hudson Valley. He said, "Who's going to pick my corn if I'm not going to have slaves?" Right? So they put in the 1809 provision where they couldn't import slaves after 1809. That's in the Constitution. So, but each one of those battles, you had the supposed the founders, they did not operate without slaves. In New York finally got rid of slavery in 1834, and that what was interesting is that there was a provision in British or English law where anybody living on soil was attached to the soil, and that they, as a possession, as a piece of property, were as important as the soil itself. And that's playing out in a case that we're doing in Diego Garcia right now, where the Chagosian Islanders, which were expelled by the British in 1965, they're arguing that they have an entitlement as a under this British law, English law, regarding the slave being a piece of property attached to the soil from where they came from. And there's a dynastic, generations connection to that. Very interesting stuff. But that it's working its way out in an actual, in English case. But look, I just wanted to emphasize here that it was nothing was easy, and New York had we could feed the world out of New York. We had great farmland, and we had, matter of fact, all of the dairy came out of New York before Minnesota, and all of the squareheads out there, the German Swedes out there. The Swedes hate the Germans, and the Germans hate the Swedes out in Minnesota. But New York had solved all those problems. We had huge dairy herds, and we had huge corn and grains, and we could still do that today if it weren't for the involvement of Bill Gates, who is from New York, from Westchester County in the southern tier. And, I was born in Manhattan. He was born in Westchester, and in the Greenberg township. But
well, yeah, you bring up Harvard. I mean, if you look, it's like the largest endowment of any university in the United States, and if you get into the history of their endowment, it's based on opium and slave trade. And when we passed laws against the slave trade, what they did was a series of corporate entities, so that it was a few steps down the line of ownership so that they wouldn't be in violation. But yeah, there's some really dodgy history on the East Coast that most people are entirely unaware. And they hear a story about them trading a bunch of trinkets to purchase Manhattan from the Indians. That's about the extent of New York history that most people get in high school, but it's considerably more than that. And but yeah, when you get into the Dutch families, and John Jay, interesting character, because he helped structure our relationship to our debt to the crown, because the different states, like Virginia, was a crown colony. It was like a corporate entity under the crown, as were other states, and they all had different agreements, and like with John Barnwell and South Carolina, and what happened in North Carolina, and all this great deal of variation. Georgia was essentially like Australia. That was like a prison colony originally, so there's a lot of really complex history going on. But what happened at the end of the Revolutionary War was that General Cornwallis surrendered, but the king never surrendered, and we still had debt to the crown through all these various entities, like the Virginia Company, and so it was John Jay who was the one who worked with Alexander Hamilton to try and come out to some kind of a structure for the debt service that was still acknowledged, because they for whatever reason, and you could get into perhaps explaining what their thinking was on that, but they wanted to honor that debt. They wanted to continue, because again, like I was saying, Rudolf Steiner's comment that the United States was founded as a commercial venture. Well, if you wanted to do business on the high seas at that time, you had to deal with the British. You just can't get around it. They're going to blow you out of the water. And the treaties that we worked under at the end of the Revolutionary War, the rights still belong to the crown, to the waterways and the high seas. So we had to deal with that, and so to set aside the debt as odious debt would have been out of the question if we wanted to continue with any kind of trading relationship with Britain or with the Dutch. So it's extremely complex.
I would suggest that again it goes back to 1302 and the Unum Sanctum, where the entirety of the globe, the planet, is still to this day under the which location of the Vatican, the Catholic Church, and the Pope. And unless you deal with that issue, for instance, Centers for Disease Control was right just a few miles away from the Georgia Guidestone, and we're looking at the question of the ownership and of the property of human beings, which are chattel in effect. But when I was putting my case together, the address is Atlanta, Georgia. I said, "Oh my God, why is the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia?"
Yeah.
But again, it's the who owns the people, who owns the chattel, right? And,
Yeah.
we haven't settled those questions. Black Lives Matter aside.
Well,
one
of the most
important, that's the good towel, right?
Of the primary sources is a book that was owned by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, all those guys.
It was on everybody's desk at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It was there on the desk, and Franklin thanked the conservator of Vattel's estate, thanking him for the English edition, and it was central to the creation of our document, and that's for sure.
The title page, the law of nations, the principles of natural law applied to conduct and to the affairs of nations and of sovereigns. A nice quotation of Cicero. This is a translation of the edition of 1758 that was put out by the Carnegie Institution, of all people, who were definitely crown agents. So you see the huge role in. I'm sorry?
I would suggest that the crown is merely an agent of the Vatican.
Well, yeah, because if you're going to honor the lineage of treaties and all the various treaties that happened throughout history, the basis of those treaties is that if we can't stick with our treaties, then there will be no basis for future treaties to be built upon. And so, like, for example, when we sidestepped the TPP, that really rattled some cages in high places, because what do you mean you're not going to sign the TPP and turn the whole world over to the corporations? It's like, but yes, the Jesuits, when you get into the understanding the Jesuits and the role of Venice and the way in which they had their reach, and they're always, people say, what are you bringing the them in for? Well, there's only a couple of them there. Well, that's all the Jesuits needed. All you got to do is go to China and the installation of Chairman Mao. And the key individual in China at that time had been there, for 35, 40 years, was the Jesuit Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Yeah, he's like, but somehow he gets... people don't remember that. And then when you look at what's going on with, like, you got Fauci and you got
that's St. Regis,
the whole cast of characters. I mean, you just go down the list. California was a Jesuit establishment.
California is under the Treaty of Hidalgo Treaty. It's where Mexico had made the Jesuits, they were banned from ever showing their presence, and that they could be executed were they to do that. So that there was an intent that California would become the refuge for the Jesuits. just like Louisiana is where Jefferson rearranged for the reemergence of the Jesuits into the country. They had been banned in 1773 by the Pope, at the same time as they had been kicked out. They were banned from the world, and they ended up going to Corsica. And all these Jesuits were on boats, and they were going to all the ports, and they didn't want to, the governments didn't want to deal with the Pope. They said, well, you've got to go someplace where the Pope isn't going to disagree. So they ended up, Ricci, ended up in Corsica, which is where they brewed up Napoleon, So they got even. They got even against the Dominicans who had taken over the Inquisition.
The Counter-Reformation. That's basically what people hear when you start talking about the Jesuits. But we have to keep in mind that the current Pope is a Jesuit, and they finally accomplished getting into the driver's seat completely. But yeah, they've been thrown out of, I don't know, over 150 different countries throughout their history for all the machinations that they've been involved with. And in fact, one of their principal centers in China was in Wuhan. And so it's you can't overlook it. But then you see it's all structuralism, so that you get into the whole idea of the metamorphosis of what we would call mercantilism, which was the idea of independent merchants going out and being involved in trade. I'll get you in a second. That's what ultimately morphed into corporatism in Holland, because they realized, hey, our investments were going bad because we'd invest in this one ship and they'd end up getting robbed by the Portuguese or whomever. And so they found that if they just put everything together under the Dutch government's protection as a corporation, and that you invested that corporation, then they had essentially a monopoly on trade with the spice and textiles and porcelain and raw materials and all manner of things. So that's how the whole idea of corporations evolved. But it's important to look at a deeper level of that, because what happened was that Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg, what they call Benelux in Europe, shorthand, was a part of the Spanish Empire at one time. And Portugal was also in there too. And Portugal was really the leader in trade with the Orient, with the Dutch trying to come up behind them. And there was tremendous struggle going on between Holland and the Spanish empire. And so it's something that developed out of that. And when you bring in Henry VIII, I mean, don't forget who his first bride was. She was of the Spanish house. And so there's so much bloodline complicated history here that we could very easily get lost in the weeds and be all very interesting. But we're trying to bring it to give us. But in bringing this forward, when you start looking, there's even the Jesuit machinations around Abraham Lincoln. He even wrote about it himself. There was that former priest that he was in communication with that published some of his letters from Abraham Lincoln. What's his name? Quinet or Quinique or something. Chiniquy, that's it. Yeah. But he was out of Canada.
But to bring us into the present, I think it's important. I was in the midst of outlining a letter to Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, who doesn't take Jesuit direction. and that he's the only one in the world at this point. Francis Xavier, along with Ricci, were involved in, and I think Francis I is the name taken from Francis Xavier in terms of restructuring China. But that I was in the midst of drafting a letter to Bolsonaro, who has the only one with any balls, including, Trump is nothing compared to Bolsonaro, because he's taken on, Brazil was part of that agreement that the Portuguese would not allow the Jesuits to come back in, period, and that they're banned. So he doesn't have to deal with the Jesuits per se, and which was one of the weaknesses that the Jesuits had to deal with in Mexico. The King of Portugal was the one who had all the Jesuits seized simultaneously and put in irons. And very important thing. I'm still for use of the Logan Act from that standpoint, and rounding up all the Jesuits and sending them back to Corsica. But that, I mean, you got to maintain a sense of humor with this stuff, John. But so the thing with Bolsonaro is real, and it's the Portuguese thing, and versus the Vatican, and that that Francis I, he was the head of he was on the board of directors of the Bank of Argentina, and he had killed a number of Maryknoll nuns and Jesuits, and actually had an arrest warrant on him. So when they made him the Pope, they got him out from under the arrest warrant. He's a wanted mass murderer out of Argentina. So the Triple Alliance and that sort of thing that come out of Bolivar, etc., and that whole thing. That's the history, which is in effect directing the ship in the direction we're going. And so when I run across the CDC being just a couple of miles from the Georgia Guidestones, where they want to eliminate 95% of the population, that's part of this. If you eliminate the population, you have no connection of the slaves on land, and it goes to the the World Economic Forum. They're named in my case, and the 800 partners who are the corporate structure which run the world. They're in the case I've got. I'm sure the judge is like cross-eyed with the thing. He said, "What the hell is this guy doing now?" So the point is that the corporate structure which comes out of the World Economic Forum is basically an extension of the Vatican's agreements. The Vatican Bank, etc. We're still dealing with these issues. They don't teach this in high school, believe me. And that anyway, as I develop this letter to Bolsonaro, it's essentially going to reflect my law memorandum that I'm doing with this case that I'm working on. But he's one of the people that we might have a chance with, Bolsonaro, which is strange. You wouldn't think you'd hear this in our conversation.
No, you wouldn't think that. And I have some good friends that are Brazilian that are still there, and some that are Brazilian that aren't still there. I have a lot of friends around the world. And Bolsonaro, he really has the courage, and I'm reminded of this rabbi out of Jerusalem, and he's saying, "Don't worry about the lambs. It's too late for them. Wake up the lions." And that's what we need. We need people with courage, to be able to.
Mussolini said.
Yeah, but
that, right?
Yeah,
Mussolini said, it's better. Yeah. He said it's better to live one day as a lion than to be a sheep.
Well, similar concept. It's not a new. It's not a new concept, but the point is that people being asleep, if somebody hasn't been woken up by the events as they've developed over the last few years, then I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, Bolsonaro. Well, it's interesting because next to Brazil is Paraguay, and Paraguay is a state founded by the Jesuits, and
Right.
a lot of leading individuals from the United States have landholdings in Paraguay, which is
Including the Bush family.
including the Bush family. Yes. And so that's kind of interesting too. And so you see a lot of these types of connections, and of course, if you're looking at what Holland did and Portugal, their relationship, because remember there was the treaty that the Vatican gave everything west of a demarcation line. I forget the exact meridian, but that's what consigned Brazil to the Portuguese was that papal judgment that came down, and that everything east of it belonged to Spain and every west of it went to Portugal. But what's interesting, because in Portugal you have the Order of Christ, and they were basically Knights Templars who, when the church came down in the Templars through Philip le Bel and his puppet Pope Clement, they just changed the name of the order. And of course, there was never any Templar ships captured. And so it's difficult to get a genuine assessment of some of those pages of history, because the cabal-style organizations tend to override institutions that had good intentions and use it as a power structure to achieve their own agenda. And so it's hard to get a clear picture of history if you work in the shallow pool, where just if something has a particular name, that means that's these guys. It's not that easy, because you have to go through different periods of history, and you have to realize that there are heroes and anti-heroes functioning in all these various organizations. Everybody's always talking about the Freemasons. Well, you know what? I mean, our country was founded by a large number of Freemasons, so you can't fault them for that. But then there are things that you can look at that are very directly tied into the machinations of Freemasonic lodges. Like all you got to do is ask Leo Zagami about the P2 Lodge. For example, your old friend Leo Zagami, he's doing okay in California. So I guess he's under the treaty that you're talking about, the Hidalgo.
Right.
Hidalgo Treaty, yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Well,
that's what Howard used.
Howard Hughes.
Was he used that in a court case in order to get landing rights for his spruce goose in the equivalent of a fjord, and that he actually argued the Hidalgo Treaty that California had no control over that. And that this treaty business is real, and it cannot be put aside, because that's what controls much of this. And the 1213 agreement and the 1302 agreement give Britain is protected by the Vatican, who has the control of the globe, the world, and that nothing happens unless the Vatican says go ahead. That's
again, going back to the point I was trying to make about treaties, is that your average individual doesn't realize the weight that a treaty possesses as regards to the international community, so to speak. And so you always have to keep that in mind, because you go, well, gee, why would this be happening? And then you have to go back sometimes very far in history. I remember, who was the guy who wanted to create his own currency down in Hunt? E. Howard. Was that E. Howard Hunt? Was that? He wanted to create his own currency and
based on silver, right?
Yeah. And but part of what he had done, he was involved with an individual that discovered some old documents regarding some holdings that had been assigned to his family from the crown. and he asserted those documents, and their procedure is that they had to allow, and so you see how governments, they don't talk about it, but they have these things in place that are still in effect, that have been around for a long time, and you won't hear about it on Fox News.
The patent system is still enforced. The Bureau of Land Management has oversight over the patents. For instance, I had an associate who was in Florida, and he wanted to know what was controlling Florida. There were so many imperial claims, including the British, who had control of Florida. Well, there's what's called the homestead patent. And remember Homestead Air Force Base that got wiped out by that hurricane. But that the Homestead patent is what controlled Florida, and it was an agreement. So that, but going back to New York, I mean, New York was coming out of Connecticut, and it went all the way to Lansing. I think it would have been Lansing, but certainly. This is a subject which needs maps, and it needs documents attached to it. Maybe we're into a thicket here, which is.
Well, this doesn't have to be our last conversation. There's plenty of spelunking that can be done in these mines. I mean, it's just because this is the part of history that nobody ever talks about, and that's why, I'm sure there's probably some people that tuned away because we got a little too far in the weeds for them. But if you want to understand what's going on, you got to be willing to go into the weeds. You got to be able to go into the thorn bush. You got when a gentleman like Christopher Strunk is talking about something, he's been in the thicket, and he's been in courtrooms with a lot of people that you read about or hear about in the news, and so he's somebody who knows from personal experience. So your father was in construction, and he was an architect. That he did work with Donald Trump's father,
with Fred.
Yeah, Fred.
My grandfather's name is Moses, all right, and my grandmother's name was Frank, Elizabeth Frank, and she was born in Prussia, and she came over here due to the starvation in 1895, 97, and everybody in the family. My grandfather Moses married her, and at that point there was if you didn't have to get your citizenship in the formal way that we do it now. You all you had to do was marry an American, you became automatically a citizen. And the family Bible, which was big, was it got passed down by the oldest daughter of the oldest son of the family, and that so Moses married Elizabeth, and but that I believe she was Jewish with the name Frank and Frank, and that it wasn't a big deal. You realize that the Jews under the Roman system had pretty much integrated themselves into Europe, and the Frankists who were involved. For instance, Alan Dershowitz is a Frankist. He's a Catholic, and that he's not Jewish. He's a Catholic, and he, as far as I was concerned, carrying out the final solution on the Jews in Israel. We haven't discussed the Jerusalem, which is at the heart of much of the claims in the world, and that the Templars were that whole piece is important, and we've left Jerusalem out of this discussion. But anyway, my family was in the Revolution. My family came here in 1754 out of Baden, Germany, and we came in and we signed an allegiance to the Pope or to the King in Philadelphia when we got off the boat and that we were farmers and we spoke German, and that's where the Pennsylvania Dutch German traditions come from. Matter of fact, one of my cousins, Roland Snyder, was still using horse and plow in the 50s. He was still plowing with a horse, right? And interesting end of the Snyder family. That's but that was the Swedes end of things. But that stuff doesn't go away easily, John. And,
Yeah.
But we had members of the family in the revolution. You know, the DAR stuff was following me around. And, you know,
Well, you know, the
Eagle Scout.
The patriarch of the Roosevelt family was
There's a story.
Yeah, he was married to one of my relatives.
Oh,
yeah. And so and he's a progenitor of both lines. There's that line with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the other line with
that's the
Teddy Roosevelt's line. But it's Cornelius, I believe was his name, but he was married to a Barnwell who was using
really
the Barn.
Get around, John.
Yeah, the Barnhill name was the Philadelphia branch of the family. That's where my branch of the family is from, the Philadelphia. So I'm from the branch that never owned any slaves. That's important. I'm not the John Barnwell of South Carolina, who was a Tuscarora Indian fighter, although they're cousins, you know. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of machinations. Well, yeah, you start talking about Howard Hughes, my grandfather on my mother's side, her dad, my mother's father, he used to be the liaison for Alcoa Aluminum to Howard Hughes. And so it's a lot of interesting stories that would fly around my family. I used to have his badge for Hughes Industries with his photo ID and all that, and it was out of aluminum, you know, because he's the one that supplied them with the aluminum to make the planes. But yeah, this is all old stuff. I mean, my family came to Philadelphia. They got there in the middle of the 1600s. I forget the exact year right now. I haven't thought about it for some time, but yeah, and John Barnwell, the other branch of the family, got in the Carolinas back in what I think it was that would have been like 1612, I believe it was. And so, yeah, my family's been here a long time too, you know, and so it really bothers me when I see people trying to undermine what we've got going here. But in order to really pull it off, we have to break away from some of these old family cabal machinations that have held us down for so long.
I think the Georgia Guidestones, when you eliminate 95% of the population, you end up with 500 million people. You know, I can only fight as much as I can fight, but certainly if somebody's stupid enough to take the jab, they're dead. They're dead men walking. And that, I mean, we're going to see many, many millions of people dead, and that a lot of family lines have disappeared, period.
Yeah, well, in the effort of not getting us to take it, I don't disagree with you. I just don't want to get this whole thing eliminated. And so, yeah, we all know what that is, and it's the George Guidestones. Geez,
Right, that's the CDC.
I mean, what a proclamation!
That's the CDC. Right?
Yeah,
which is a private corporation, by the way.
Yeah, and the Ted Turner was one of the key contributors creating the Georgia Guidestones, and it's amazing that they make such claims like that. But there's a lot more of us than there is of them, and at this point, and so we'll have to just see how it all rolls out. But I think that what we're looking at is the ultimate struggle between the free spiritual life as proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence versus the Malthusian materialism, and that comes out of the City College London, that whole crowd. I mean, and the straight up materialism of the Jesuit order. You can't really conceive of them as being a spiritual organization because they're largely a real estate company.
They're military.
Yeah, it's a military real estate company.
Right. Yeah. Sharp as a tack. Absolutely.
Yeah.
A map tack.
Yeah, and their methodology is quite ingenious, though, and that's why Cecil Rhodes used the Jesuit order as the model for what he put together with the Rhodes Trust and all of that. If you go to our previous episode that I posted last week of the AIM Cats Conclave, where we laid out some of the story of the Imperial Press Conference and how it ties into all the events that have unrolled in the last 110 years or so here in the United States, is the long arm of the crown. But again, that's the long arm of the crown, like what Christopher's saying, that has to be understood within the context of the Catholic establishment of the basis of treaties, and going back that there's the Treaty of Trent, the Treaty of Verona. You can go down. There's a whole sequence of treaties that have established the way in which the distribution of power is handled on the international level, and most people are absolutely oblivious of that. But somebody like Roy Cohn was very much versed in it, and he was
absolutely.
Yeah, he
House
was
on Un-American Affairs Committee.
Yeah, he was, and that's what you have to understand, is that when the whole thing went on with like Roy Cohn and the anti-communist thing, part of that was that it was a struggle against the crown. Okay, because you have to understand the establishment of communism in Russia was brought into being through the machinations coming out of the Privy Council in the City of London. See, and then you see a counter attack against the Catholic Church at the end of the Soviet Union, where they sent a couple thousand people into the Catholic Church, and they infiltrated the Catholic Church from the communist regime in the Soviet Union. So there's all this behind the scenes stuff going on that some of it you might not even want to talk about too much, because you want to end up on a short list.
The whole issue of communism really is I consider it Jesuitism, and that the left and right, that's sort of, Adam Weishaupt was the one who created the Jacobin movement in order to punish the Jacobins or the Dominicans, and to punish the throne, cut people's heads off and all that business. That's the Jacobin movement. That's Jesuit, pure and simple, out of Adam Weishaupt. And that communism, matter of fact, the Jesuits had to correct what they had done in the French Revolution and create this Saul Alinsky modification with Antonio Gramsci to correct the mistakes, the supposed mistakes of the French Revolution. In other words, they were open to be painted with a broad brush, and that they haven't changed it. They haven't changed an iota, the Jesuits, but nonetheless, they punished all the Dominicans, and they re-seized control of the Inquisition, and that I've lost my train of thought here. I mean, it's just we have a situation where the Jesuit, I don't recognize the Rasputin thing you're talking about. He was a Jesuit connected when they got banned. Catherine the Great essentially allowed them to go into Georgia, right, into Georgia, Russia, and they became Capuchin monks, but they were all Jesuits. But otherwise, they re-insinuated themselves into the Russian throne through Rasputin, and that Marx he was Jewish. He was converted to Catholicism when he was in Trier, and he was educated by Beckett, who became the Black Pope. He was the elementary school teacher in Trier of Marx. He taught Marx, but you couldn't get into a Catholic school unless you became a Catholic. So all this goes to the Vatican. But the Jesuits ran this whole thing, and that when I hear the name Marx, I think of the Jesuits. That's all. And that's their Jesuit catechism. Period.
Yes, but you have to keep in mind that when the revolutionary forces were rising up in Russia, the Tsar asked for help from Britain, because it was like a family thing. You got all these.
It's a family deal. Right?
Yeah,
German.
so many rulers that they tied into Queen Victoria.
Right.
Yeah, and he was promised money, and but when the representative from the Privy Council showed up there, one of the close associates of Cecil Rhodes, Lord Milner, when he showed up in St. Petersburg, he didn't give them the money that they needed to fight back the Bolshevik revolution. And
give to Trotsky.
Yeah, and
that was Wall Street.
Yeah, Wall Street in London, but
nothing would have happened, John, without Wall Street in New York. New York is at the center of evil.
Yeah,
and the Big Apple is actually, if you translate it, is the big evil, and that.
In fact, this whole conversation here stems from a phone call we had the other day. I said, well, the Big Apple. I said, in Latin, that's magnum malum. It means big evil, because the word for apple in Latin is evil. It's like the Adam and Eve thing. And so when you transplant that to the city of New York, that's the big evil. And so, I'm laughing. I don't know that it's even funny, but it is kind of funny. But yeah, so what now? What?
Now what?
Yeah.
Well, look, the federal judiciary are totally controlled. I'm reassured that when the Supreme Court judges go get a honorarium twice a year from the Chinese Communist Party in China, they get $1 million per presentation, and each one of them, all 9 of them. And I'm told that it's written within their rules that they can take their honorariums without being considered traitors, and that we have no federal system. It doesn't exist. And I'm trying to generate through this. I was wanting to show maps and that sort of thing of the counties and everything. I've served we have 62 counties. I've served 62 sheriffs. Like we have the sheriffs of Nottingham, 62 of them, and that they're the local law enforcement. We have citizen grand juries at that level. The sheriffs have the right to issue warrants, without permission. They just issue a warrant. And that, so I'm trying to argue in court, and the judge doesn't want to hear it, basically. And but that's fine. I'm making a public record. Somebody's going to make this. Most of the people I worked with in the 80s had numbers on their arm. They were Jews out of Brooklyn, and that New York is famous for being both the proving ground and the dumping ground for all of the pharmaceutical industry's mistakes. Thalidomide and DMS and DES rather. It's the I worked in the system with Facilities Development Corporation, where all of the I worked I was actually involved as a field engineer in 14 facilities, and there were a lot more of them, both in the psychiatric end of things and in the developmental disability end of things for the retarded that were created by the pharmaceutical industry. And that we'd have people fly in from Europe and drop them off at Idlewild airport to become citizens. They'd be branded as citizens, and they'd be immediately taken to the developmental centers to be housed as a error of the pharmaceutical tests that were being run on populations in Europe. But my take on things, we've got to bring things local, and that I believe that it's possible to have a county have its own currency, and it's possible that they can use as an asset their federal matching funds to back up that currency. And this is what Catherine Austin Fitts talks about. But the idea is that if you look at the maps of every state, they have the capability of solving problems locally. For instance, in New York State, we have what's called home rule law, where you don't need a government. All you need is voters in the county or in the town. And you don't need elected officials. You can get together and do referendums without permission and just collect the signatures based upon the gubernatorial election. And you can actually run a town or a county on the basis of that. And that's in law. We don't need government at all. All we need is active citizens declaring through a vote. And that's why this vote is so important. I mean, totally corrupt, absolutely corrupt. I don't want to get you thrown off within some of this discussion, but
well, no, it's true. I mean, there's nullification, for example. Right. You know that the states have the right within the American system of jurisprudence to be able to use nullification to set aside certain actions of the federal government. You have to understand the federal government was created to protect our rights and to oversee the operation of ports and collect tariffs and stuff. That's what they were created for initially, ideally.
In my case, you know,
they are.
New York ratified in 1788. We ratified the federal constitution after they kicked it around for several years, and New York insisted on certain things. There had to be a natural-born citizen clause. In other words, your parents had to be citizens at the time of your birth, period, and there had to be a chain of familial interests, so that you if you married into a royal family, they didn't become the inheritor of land and that sort of thing. But so New York had dealt with these questions. We had huge amounts of resources, both in iron and precious gems and great farmland, and that we were not about to give it up to the crown because we had fought them, and that it's just that when we did the ratification in 1788, in July of 1788, we said we can declare ourselves independent at any point that we don't like what the federal structure that we're setting up does. And that's in the ratification document. So that we don't, secession's all that baloney business, and the convention of the states, convention of the states. That's a nightmare, it's really, but we have the ability to declare ourselves independent in a county, in a town and a county basis in New York. We don't need the federal government, period. And we have the basis for that historically.
Texas is another state that has that type of an agreement. They can just leave the United States. It's written into the initial agreement that they signed to become a part of the United States. So that if they didn't like it, they could leave.
I think the Hidalgo, they're part of the Hidalgo treaty, and that
Arizona, New Mexico, and California were all a part of the Hidalgo treaty with Mexico, named after the gentleman Hidalgo who was involved in setting that up. And so, yeah, there's a lot of interesting treaty things that you can find if you dig under the hood a little bit. I mean, if you look at the role of Andrew Jackson and his relationship to Martin Van Buren
Van Buren, right, which is
that
Mid-Hudson County.
brings in that Dutch element again.
Either Putnam or Dutchess County.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And and then you get the Baratarian coast that over near to the west of New Orleans and going off towards Galveston area. That was actually a pirate nation at one time called the Baratarian Coast, which is interesting because Barthélemy Lafont, who's the architect of the French Quarter in New Orleans, he was one of the top astronomers in North America, and he was a collector of Rosicrucian writings and all of that. He was a very interesting fellow. He was played by Charles Boyer in the movie that they did about Jean Lafitte, the pirate, who really the leader of that group, and they ended up helping Andrew Jackson in that was the war of what was the name of the war down there that they had with the French? But yeah, so there's a lot of
Jackson, Battle of New Orleans.
Yeah, the Battle of New Orleans. Yeah, they had a song about that back.
The War of 1812.
War of 1812. Thank you. Yeah, 1812. That was really how Jackson came into prominence, was through the War of 1812. And but he had Yul Brynner playing
Yul Brynner,
John Lafitte, and Charles Boyer was playing the character who was essentially Barthélemy Lafont, the architect of the French Quarter. And he was smart enough to put the buildings of the French Quarter on high ground so that when hurricanes come in there, the buildings are still standing. You know, he did
Washington D.C., right? Washington D.C.
No, he was an associate of he was a close associate. The gentleman that did Washington D.C. I forget the guy's name right now, but he was the other guy who was also an astronomer architect, and he was the guy who did Central Park also. I can't think of his name right now, but that's a whole interesting story. And I don't want to start looking it up right now. Well, geez, we don't want to go too long here. We usually only go no more than 90 minutes, but I thank everybody for checking in here. And do you have any websites, information you want to share beyond what I've posted below here? You're welcome to, Chris.
I put up the Save Our New York website, and that's the one specifically dealing with New York issues and politics. And I sued the legislature in Cuomo when they did the infanticide law, and that and of course they sell the body parts to create for the pharmaceutical and cosmetic industry. You know, when they got away from using eggs as the basis for doing growing various drugs, vaccines, they went to other dastardly processes, and of course Cuomo, the Jesuits got involved in converting the Planned Parenthood, which is the Gates family, an IBM crowd, so that Save Our New York. And if anybody's interested in seeing the record I'm trying to create for this here in Warren County, I'm trying to figure out how to educate. I'm going to use the Bolsonaro letter to put it into the record to educate the judge, to sort of split him away from his ability to act, to give him an opportunity. I think he may be a Mason, so we elect our judges here, so he got elected without any contributions, which is interesting. He used his own money. Anyway.
Yeah, the architect we were trying to think of was Agatha Velvet on the Olmsted.
That's right.
Olmsted, Olmstead. Yeah, Olmsted. That was the that architect. Yeah, it's a fascinating study, and those of you that don't know me already, I'm the author of two books that are available on eBay, and one is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the spiritual signs of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity, which flowed from the order of the flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order. And Douglas Gabriel wrote the foreword to it. And that's some 640 pages with extensive diagrams. And my second book is The Arcana of Light on the Path, which is more of a meditative tool. The foreword by the note of distrust for William Bento. And in there, I lay out so much of the cosmology associated with the esoteric Christian view. And like I said, you can get those on eBay from me directly, or if you're outside the US, you can contact me directly through my academia website, which is, I have it down below, or you can contact me by private message on Facebook, and we can work something out. I've been shipping them around the world. And Chris here is like, yeah, he's a national treasure. He's got stones, as they say here in Detroit, and he's the guy that really does it. But I'm sure that we'll end up doing this again because we've just scratched the surface. That it just we don't want to overwhelm people because when we get rolling, it's hard for us to get off the phone because we have so many pieces of the puzzle that we've tumbled into. Over the many years that we've looked at these types of things, and it's interesting how many cross connections we find that just keep rolling out. But yeah, Bolsonaro right now, he's one of the few leaders on the planet that I can say that I have any confidence in, and so it should be interesting. I really and truly wish him the best, because this is going to be a dark, challenging period in the upcoming few years, and so I can only wish him the best. But is there anything you want to say in closing? By all means.
Well, we've got to find a way to deport all of the Jesuits again, like they were in 1773. That's the only reason we were able to have the revolution, because we essentially had them extirpated, and they've got to be extirpated again. Yeah. And that these are very serious people. These are military men who are who are willing to kill in all manners methods, and they do. They absolutely do. So
Rudolf Steiner's troubles began when he gave a lecture series from Jesus to Christ, in which he pointed out the differences between what he was doing and the Jesuits. And that's when his troubles began, so to speak. And ultimately, the Goetheanum was burned to the ground, and just a lot of machinations against him. So, yeah, I can't stress strongly enough that it's well worth consulting with all the efforts that's been done by Chris Strunk here.
Well, it's Eric John Phelps. He's my partner, and he's the expert on this. He might be.
Well, yeah. What's his book? Vatican Assassins. They should be published.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I went and looked for it the other day, and it was like $1,200 for a used copy.
Right. It's but Eric might be up to discussion. You know, he's got a wealth of information. It's like, I think we were just scratching the surface on this business, and I know that's a fact. You know, he would be an interesting historical inclusion here. You know, as a third head, and that.
I'm open. I'm open to it. He's living in Jerusalem now, isn't he?
No, he's in Pennsylvania.
He's back.
Oh, he's in Pennsylvania, Newmanstown, and that. Yeah, his wife is, she's now a citizen, but she was an Israeli. And that, I don't know. But yeah, again, I think I'm the only one attacking Alan Dershowitz on the question of he's doing what Hitler was unable to do, the final solution on the Jews, when you look at 95% of them being vaccinated, they were being jabbed. But
Yeah, well, Dershowitz, I mean, I was involved in a case with the Federal Trade Commission and the FDA some 20 years ago or so, and Alan Dershowitz's cousin was our attorney in that action, and he's a former commissioner of the FTC. So yeah, it's interesting the way those types of organizations in our government are so intimately tied in with corporate interests. And so that's about all I want to say about that right now. But there's really a blurring going on in the SES and all the work we've done and we've shared over the years regarding the SES and the picking winners that they do. And it's a sad state of affairs when you start looking at it as a natural citizen to be confronted with these types of corporate it's pure corporatism, whatever you want to call it. You can call it collectivism is probably the best word, because that will include all the different isms that have to do with centralization of power. And it's the decentralization of power is what we're pointing at here, and that's what Chris is talking about. We don't really need Washington. What do? All the, in this day and age, it's just not needed. There's just not, all these different branches of a couple million people that are in government. It's like, it's just an archaicism that's still around, because people can make money by going there.
Well, they needed some way to pay off Britain through the tax structure, through the capitation, and that they were the central tax collector for paying for the reparations of our seizure of British land.
Yeah,
and this is the Jay Treaty, and that.
The Jay Treaty, and don't forget that the Bank of England was founded in Singapore.
In 1697, right?
Yeah.
That's for William and Mary.
Well, listen, Chris,
the Jesuits who did it, because the Jesuits controlled the banks in Europe, and they were brought in to actually devise the creation of the Bank of England.
Yeah,
we could
go on another 4 hours, but I think that why don't we just say that we're going to have another chapter in this conversation, and yeah, I'd love to bring in your associate. I mean,
Eric can bring the level of detail that I'm.
He's a detail guy.
Amazing. Yeah, even Gabriel Douglas was impressed by the level of detail that he had.
Oh yeah, no, he's definitely focused on that topic, and so again, I can't thank you enough. And anybody that if you want to buy me a cup of coffee, and I can share a cup of coffee with Chris too, you could PayPal.me/John Barnwell 888, and I don't know if you have a PayPal account or not. No, but
no, I'm just trying to create a public record. When the people I talked to the rabbi, the minion that I worked with, and I said, well, what would you do? And they said, and they all had numbers on their arm. You've got to create a public record, because the public record will survive. And that's one thing you can say about the KGB, and that John Loftus, who went and looked at the KGB files in order to find out about American history, is that they're meticulous in terms of records, because that way they can point their finger at somebody else.
Yeah.
And so
no,
records are really important.
I fully acknowledge your efforts, and I've even had minuscule contributions regarding some of the little actions that you dream up that are very important in establishing a public record. They become official documents, and if somebody needs them in another case, that they could be used as already certified into the court. So it's an extremely important thing. Well, Chris, thank you so much.
Yep, you bet.
And let's see where all this goes. Take care, my friend.
Good. All right, take care.